A Khmer king may command the most extensive water landscape yet mapped for any pre-industrial city. But this morning the water begins with you, ankle deep beside a bank that is making the wrong sound. A thin trickle is whispering through packed earth where no opening was intended, while a mat of leaves has appointed itself engineer and is already pursuing a private plan. If long histories like this honestly make your evenings easier, you may like or subscribe and tell me where you are listening and your local time. Let the room grow dim and settle where the day asks least of your body. You are following an adult Khmer worker, a careful composite rather than a person named in a record, in Greater Angkor as the wet monsoon turns serious. The next hard rain is close. You do not begin by digging. You begin by becoming still enough to separate one sound from another. Rainwater ticks from leaves behind you. A fuller channel moves somewhere beyond the grass, with the broad, even murmur of water following a bed already made for it. The sound beneath your feet is narrower. It starts, fades, and starts again, as if a small hidden mouth in the embankment is testing whether anyone is listening. No medieval instruction book survives to tell us the precise sequence an Angkorian worker used at such a moment. The person you inhabit is therefore assembled only from the physical problem the earthworks preserve. A bank built of local soils has to be watched when it becomes wet. A channel partly hidden by plants has to be seen before it can be cleared. Water appearing on the wrong side of a barrier has to be traced back toward its source before an intervention makes matters worse. You crouch and touch the darkened earth with 2 fingers. The surface is damp, but not yet sliding. A line of tiny bubbles rises where the trickle enters a shallow footprint. That does not tell you whether the water is passing through the bank, curling around its end, or simply spilling from a clogged cut nearby. It tells you only that the problem is small enough to inspect and lively enough not to ignore. You stand, wipe your fingers against your palm, and walk uphill along the bank, rather than attacking the first wet patch that has volunteered for attention. The top of the embankment is not a ceremonial causeway. It is a low working ridge, softened by rain and crossed by roots. Your left foot finds firmer reddish earth. Your right sinks just enough to make a clean step impossible. Mud has no objection to the scale of Angkor, but it does insist on accompanying the person assigned to maintain it. You shorten your stride. The bank contains sand and clay in changing proportions, and after repeated wetting those materials do not behave as one obedient substance. The sandy places let water enter quickly. The finer soils hold it longer, then become slick. The exact construction of this reach is unknown to us, and you cannot see its full interior, but the surface gives clues. A shallow sag collects rain. A tuft of grass leans downhill. On the outer face, the damp stain broadens below a root. You press the heel of your hand against the upper slope. The soil yields slightly and stops. Farther along, water has pooled against a small rise of silt and fallen leaves in the intended channel. The pool is only a handspan deeper than the moving water behind it, yet that difference is enough to send a searching thread sideways. This is the first useful consequence. The whisper below may not mark a deep failure in the bank at all. It may be water escaping because the proper route has lost a little capacity. You do not celebrate. A small diagnosis is merely permission to look more carefully. You move toward the obstructed cut, placing each foot where last season's harder ground still shows beneath the new green growth. To you, vegetation makes the channel look settled. It is not. Stems bend across the water, roots catch loose sediment, and broad leaves lie flat enough to slow a current that was already gentle. None of this is evidence of neglect by itself. Plants return quickly in a monsoon landscape. Their success is ordinary. The difficulty begins when ordinary growth changes the small differences in level on which the root depends. Wishu on the ball, on the minty juicetif, where you reach into the water and lift the upper layer of leaves. They rise together, stitched by fine roots and decaying fibers. Beneath them sits a tongue of silt, pale brown where your fingers disturb it. The intended opening is wider than the moving thread now using it. Enough space remains for water, but not enough to pass the coming rain without backing up. You place the leaf mat on the upper bank, rather than letting it drift downstream and establish a second career. Water immediately noses into the narrow gap you have exposed. It does not rush. It slides a little faster, darkening a strip of bed that had been dry. Below you, the wrong whisper continues. The obstruction is part of the answer, not yet the whole of it, and you follow the newly moving edge toward the junction. Before you, the junction is hardly grand enough to deserve the word. One shallow channel approaches from the north, another angles away toward a lower pond and field edge. A third depression, less regular and more heavily grown, continues south. From above, a modern map might give these lines a clean geometry. At ankle height, they are a negotiation among roots, old cuts, fresh silt, and the slight tilt of the plain. You kneel where the three meet. The northern flow presses against a rounded shoulder of earth before dividing. The side route toward the pond is taking more water than its present depth can comfortably carry. The southern bed, intended to receive part of the flow, is choked at its entrance. The small pool behind the choke has risen until water finds the weakest edge of the bank. That weak edge is close to the damp stain you heard below. The sources do not preserve the voices at this junction, or tell us who had authority to choose. You do not invent a regulation to make the scene tidy. You inspect both exits. You push a thin stem into the silt at the southern mouth and feel the bed beneath it. The deposit is shallow near the edge, deeper in the center. That suggests a small clearing can restore capacity without cutting a new channel. You mark the line with your hand and look downstream before moving anything more. You walk north first, because the water at your knees has a history before it reaches you. Beyond the immediate bank, the land rises almost imperceptibly toward the sandstone heights of Phnom Kulen and other northern catchments. Rain falling there enters streams and spreads across a plain whose slope is so gentle that a few handspans of elevation can decide whether water gathers, stalls, or turns aside. Angkor's builders did not create the monsoon. They worked within its arrival. Across the northern zone, east-west embankments intercepted and spread flows coming from the higher ground. Natural channels were redirected or joined to engineered ones. Water could be collected, slowed, or guided south. Archaeologists can map many of those banks and channels, and models can test how water might have moved through them. Neither kind of evidence records the exact decision made on this wet morning. You stop where the approaching channel widens. The current carries small leaves and a faint cloud of suspended soil. A twig circles once against the inner bank, then passes. The flow is steady, which means the obstruction below, rather than a sudden surge above, is probably creating the local rise at the junction. From here you can see no reservoir, no great temple moat, and certainly no lake. Yet the water beside your ankle belongs to a chain extending far beyond sight. Northern collectors receive the wet season. Central works store, delay, display, and redirect part of it. Southern channels distribute water or carry excess toward lower country and, ultimately, the Tonle Sap. The catchment has sent no apology for arriving all at once. You turn back toward the junction with that larger pattern present only as a practical fact. What you release here will continue somewhere you cannot see. On the return, you cross the crest of an east-west bank. It interrupts the natural downhill tendency just enough to make water spread along its upper side. Such banks form one of the recurring elements in the provisional model scholars have built from maps, surveys, excavation, and elevation data. They could collect flows from the north and northeast before openings or channels sent portions south. You might call Angkor a hydraulic city, a phrase that captures something real about the importance of waterworks. It can also become too neat. Greater Angkor was a dispersed, low-density urban complex, not a compact stone center wrapped around a single reservoir. Large works associated with rulers existed beside thousands of smaller ponds. habitation mounds, fields, paths, and community temples. Water management could be state-sponsored, locally organized, or some changing mixture of the two. You step over a shallow notch where water crosses the bank. The notch may have been adjusted many times. Its present form does not reveal who first cut it or who last cleared it. It does reveal a persistent problem. Water held along an embankment needs a route onward, and that route must remain lower than the places water might choose for itself. The plain between the northern catchments and the Tonle Sap falls gently. That shallow gradient made enormous connections possible, because water did not have to descend through a steep valley. It also made alignment unforgiving. A bank a little too high could hold water. A channel a little too shallow could lose its current. Sediment placed by one season could reverse the advantage created by an earlier cut. At the junction, you lower a short length of straight branch onto the water. One end touches the surface near the northern entrance. The other points toward the southern bed. This is not presented as a documented Angkorian surveying instrument. It is simply a plausible way for our composite worker to steady the eye while reading a very small difference in level. The water itself remains the better guide. Fine floating fragments gather at the blocked mouth, then drift toward the pond branch. You scoop away one handful of loose silt from the edge of the southern opening. The pool quivers. A narrow ribbon enters the cleared space and stops against the deeper plug. Below the bank, the wrong trickle weakens for several breaths, then returns. That response confirms the connection. Lowering the pool relieves pressure at the seep. The temptation is to clear quickly. The landscape advises patience. If you cut the whole plug at once, backed up water may carry the loosened sediment south, perhaps lodging it at a narrower bend. If you clear too little, the next rain will restore the pool. You scrape a second shallow groove along the intended bed and wait again. The ribbon lengthens. Its quiet progress is not impressive from a causeway. At this scale, however, it is the beginning of control, or at least of a temporary agreement. You leave the groove and walk the first stretch of the southern channel. Its bed is broader than the moving water, with a dry shoulder on one side and soft deposits on the other. A low mound beside it may support habitation, a small shrine, or activity whose precise character is no longer recoverable. Farther on, the channel passes under a path through a shallow crossing rather than a stone bridge. You test the channel bed with your foot. The upper layer shifts, but the deeper surface holds. There is room for more flow. Near the path, however, cut grass and leaf fragments have gathered against a root. You pull them free and place them above the high water stain. The channel has opinions about leaves, and its position is consistent. They are welcome only when arranged across the narrowest possible place. Beyond the crossing, the bed opens and the slope continues south. No person is visible there, but the absence does not make the route empty. Water sent this way may reach a field, another pond, a moat, a larger channel, or a disposal line. You cannot know every downstream claim. You can know that this first reach will accept a little more without immediately spilling. You turn back to widen the groove by degrees. At the junction again, you remove the next layer of the plug from the downstream side rather than the pool side. The distinction matters. Working from below gives the loosened water somewhere to go, while leaving a thin lip to restrain the pool until you are ready. The exact technique is imaginative staging, not a recovered manual. Its logic belongs to the visible physics of the place. The water beside the lip trembles. You slide 2 fingers through the remaining silt and open a gap no wider than your hand. A brown thread pours through, carrying small grains but no heavy clump. It follows the shallow groove you prepared, crosses the exposed bed, and reaches the cleared route by the path. Nothing spills. The wrong trickle through the bank becomes intermittent. This tiny success brings the title-sized landscape into view without requiring you to see it all. The junction is one point in a mapped web extending across more than 1,000 square kilometers. Channels and embankments connect northern catchments to central reservoirs and moats, then to distributors and drains across the lower plain. The mapped Greater Angkor region is larger still. No known pre-industrial urban complex has a wider mapped extent in Angkor's survey. That does not mean scholars have measured every litre moved at Angkor and ranked it against every earlier city. The evidence supports extraordinary mapped extent, not a precise global table of hydraulic throughput. No league table brings a shovel. From your position, the careful claim feels more convincing than the boast. A network can be immense and still depend on a hand opening a gap in silt. You keep the lip in place and watch the first release travel beyond the path. The flow now divides three ways. The pond branch still receives the largest share. The southern groove takes a narrow, steady ribbon. Only a damp shine remains at the outer face of the bank. You place your palm flat above that shine and feel no movement beneath the surface. Though the soil is cool and saturated, you have no map. You carry a working sequence instead. Water arrives from the higher north. Banks spread or intercept it. Channels turn it towards storage and settlement. Openings divide it again. Lower roots receive what continues south. This sequence is broad enough to guide your attention, and modest enough not to pretend every feature operated together in every century. A frog slips from the exposed silt into the pond branch. You wait until its ripples disappear. Then look at the dividing current. The southern ribbon is clearing its own narrow line through the loosened deposit. That is useful, but it can also deepen the groove faster than intended if the rain strengthens. You gather the removed silt above the bank, away from immediate runoff, and shape none of it into a permanent structure. For now, you need a reversible adjustment and another downstream check. Your path turns toward a moat visible between trees. Its water lies broader and darker than the channel, reflecting a stone tower in broken pieces whenever the breeze moves. Moats around Angkorian temples carried meaning as well as water. Reservoirs and enclosures could evoke sacred geography, ordered space, and the relationship between temple, ruler, and cosmos. Their physical connections to channels do not cancel those meanings, nor does ritual meaning make the water imaginary. A moat holds a real volume. Its banks can erode. Its level can rise and fall. It can receive runoff or connect with a channel. Scholars have long debated how much particular barrays and moats served irrigation, domestic supply, flood management, storage, display, or ritual. The evidence often permits more than one function, and the functions may have changed. You do not pause to choose between sacred and practical, because the water crossing your path is already both part of a meaningful landscape and a wet substance seeking lower ground. At the moat's outer corner, a narrow feeder channel shows no unusual rise. That means the release at your junction has not yet reached this point, or it follows another branch. A causeway crosses the moat farther west. People move along it with baskets and wrapped loads, their figures small against the stone approach. The monumental view suggests permanence. Your muddy calves offer a quieter correction. Every water edge below that causeway changes with rain, roots, sediment, and use. You return along the channel, noting the level against a projecting route. It is only a temporary reference, not a calibrated gauge. When you come back after the next shower, the route will tell you whether the local surface has risen, fallen, or remained close to where it is now. Between the moat and your junction, small ponds appear in openings beside raised occupation mounds. Some are almost square, others have softened corners or irregular edges. They are not decorative afterthoughts around a temple city. Thousands of ponds formed part of the inhabited landscape, close to houses, paths, fields, and community shrines. The great works and the small ones existed together. A ruler could sponsor a barry, a moat, or a major channel. A temple community or household could depend on a nearby pond and make decisions within the reach of local labor. Archaeologists describe this as a mixture of top-down and bottom-up management, sometimes joined in hybrid arrangements. The phrase is modern. The practical situation is visible beside you. A large channel may deliver or remove water, while a family still has to keep the approach to its own pond usable. You kneel and clear one loose leaf from the dry lip, then stop. This is not your repair to enlarge without knowing the local need. The restraint is part of maintenance. Every connection creates a possibility in both directions. Back at the junction, the pool has dropped a finger's breadth against the grass stems. The pond branch remains open. The southern ribbon has widened on its own. The damp face of the bank no longer whispers, but the earth is still wet enough to remember the pressure that was there. You stand above the dividing point and imagine the claims below it, not as a list of invisible owners, but as consequences. More water toward the pond may preserve a local store, yet flood a path if the surface rises too quickly. More water south may relieve the bank, yet send sediment into a narrow crossing. Holding water here may protect one lower reach, yet leave the saturated embankment under pressure. There is no adjustment without an elsewhere. You return immediately to the lip under your hand. The remaining plug is firm enough to restrain the pool, but soft enough to cut in stages. You open a second narrow notch beside the first. Two ribbons join a few steps downstream. The water takes a trace of loose silt, then clears. At the outer bank face, no new bubble forms in the footprint. You press the damp soil inward with the flat of your palm, not building a grand repair, but closing the tiny surface cavity left by the seep. The clay-rich patch accepts the pressure. A sandy edge slumps, so you leave it rather than pretending wet sand can be persuaded by confidence alone. The downstream channel rises slightly and settles. The pond branch slows by a small degree. You watch long enough to see that both routes continue. Water has signed nothing. The result is imperfect, which is another way of saying it belongs to a real landscape. A woven basket lies where you left it above the bank. We cannot know the exact basket, toolkit or crew arrangement at this junction. Baskets, wooden implements, hands and carried earth are plausible in a society that built vast earthen works, but the staging remains deliberately ordinary. You use the basket only to move loose vegetation and wet silt far enough from the opening that the next shower will not wash them straight back. The first load is mostly leaves. Water drains through the weave and down your forearm. The second carries heavier silt, which pulls at one side and makes the basket tilt. Monumental reservoirs are admirably symmetrical from a distance. A load of mud is less committed to geometry. You spread the material on firm ground behind the bank, rather than piling it on the saturated crest. Then you return for a third, smaller load from the southern mouth. The cleared opening now shows its older bed as a slightly harder surface beneath the recent deposit. You do not deepen beyond that surface. Restoring a root is different from making a new one. The pool falls another little measure. Air enters a root cavity on the bank side and releases a final string of bubbles. You press damp soil into the shallow opening and cover it with a thin layer from the firmer crest. This is a modest, plausible closure, not a claim about an official Angkorian repair standard. When you lift the basket again, the channel divides without backing up. The southward water is still shallow enough for leaves to catch, so you walk beside it and remove two stems leaning across the current. The basket follows at your hip, dripping a dotted line along the path. The southern channel bends around a mound and meets a broader cut aligned toward the lower plain. Here the water from your junction spreads thinly across half the bed. The other half carries an older trickle from the east. Where they meet, each current pushes the other toward the center, creating a faint ridge of moving sediment. This is a downstream consequence, though not yet a dangerous one. If the release from your junction strengthens, the meeting currents may scour the middle or deposit silt along one edge. If the eastern trickle grows first, it may back water toward the path you cleared. The condition asks for observation, not a dramatic intervention. Beyond this point, the channel belongs to a southern arrangement of distributors and drains that becomes harder to follow from the ground. Some routes served fields or storage, others carried excess away. Later remodeling could cut across earlier alignments. Archaeology maps form and sequence where dating is possible, but the complete operating history remains beyond reach. You need no complete history to decide the next action. The joined flow is not rising against either bank. The path crossing upstream remains clear. You return to the basket, where a small leaf has lodged through the weave with the persistence of an official seal. You remove it, set the basket upright, and begin the walk back to the junction before the sky darkens further. At the junction, the two notches through the remaining lip have widened slightly. Moving water has polished their edges. The pool no longer reaches the weak place in the bank, but the southern bed now carries enough flow to disturb loose grains. You press a small amount of firmer damp earth against one notch, narrowing it until both cuts pass equal ribbons. Again, this is our composite worker responding to simple conditions, not a reconstructed regulation. You then clear the pond branch only where a curled leaf has caught against a stem. The branch must continue to receive water. Closing it would solve your bank problem by exporting too much water south. The point is not to make one channel win. It is to let the junction divide the present flow without pressing hard against the vulnerable edge. A rumble travels across the plain. It may be thunder beyond the trees, or a cart on a distant embankment. You do not wait to decide. You check the route reference near the moat. The water there is unchanged. You check the path crossing. The southern channel remains within its bed. You check the seep. The footprint holds only raindrips from leaves, not bubbles from below. The inspection has become a circuit. Source, obstruction, division, downstream meeting, return. Its scale fits inside a walk. Its consequences enter a network that does not. Before the first heavy drops, you climb a slightly higher bank from which three kinds of water space can be seen at once. A small pond lies close to habitation. The temple moat forms a broad, ordered rectangle beyond it. Farther west, hidden by trees and distance, the great reservoir occupies a scale your eye cannot gather from this place. You shade your eyes and look north. The catchment is already grey with rain. Water will arrive through natural streams and engineered channels, across banks that spread it, past openings narrower than the bodies of the reservoirs they serve. Whatever the intentions of kings, temples, communities and households, the monsoon will test the physical connections together. You descend to the junction. The first large drop strikes the basket. Another darkens the bank beside your hand. In a few moments the leaf surfaces are stippled. The channel sound thickens, not yet from new upstream flow, but from rain falling directly into the bed. You lift the basket away from the crest and place it on firm ground. Then you crouch at the divided current. The repair does not need to last forever. It needs to carry this rain without turning the quiet, damp place below into an opening. Rain begins in separate impacts, each one visible on the pool. Then the impacts join, and the whole surface becomes restless. Water runs from the bank crest in clear threads, gathers a skin of soil, and reaches the channel brown. You use the side of your hand to break one tiny runoff groove that points toward the old seep, turning it instead toward the open bed. The northern channel rises first. Floating leaves move faster. At the junction, the pond branch and two southern notches accept the increase. The pool climbs, pauses below the weak edge, and begins to fall again as the openings clear. You walk to the outer face. Rainwater now covers everything, making it harder to distinguish a renewed seep from surface runoff. You shield the damp patch with your palm for several breaths. No bubble forms, no concentrated thread pushes out. The bank is merely wet, which is an unhelpfully broad condition during a monsoon, but still better than a whisper from within. You stand and look downstream. The southern channel has darkened to its full width. It remains inside the bed. Your next task is to see what the stronger release does where the two currents meet. Rain turns the path crossing slick, so you approach it from the higher side. The channel beneath has risen by the width of 2 fingers against the exposed root. Water curls around the root without overtopping the path. A cluster of fresh leaves has already reached the narrow place and begun to arrange itself with familiar ambition. You lift the leaves before they settle. The current takes the smaller fragments and carries them through. The larger ones go into the basket. Your repair at the junction has increased the southern flow exactly as expected, and the first downstream inconvenience has appeared exactly where a constriction made it likely. The network has not failed. It has handed you the next piece of work. Past the crossing, the channel enters the broader cut. The joined currents now meet with visible force. Brown water from your route pushes against clearer water from the east. The central ridge of silt dissolves and travels onward in a low cloud. Both banks remain intact. You wait until the cloud thins and can see the bed again. The provisional map of Angkor's water system divides the landscape into broad northern, central and southern zones. Up north, banks and channels gathered and spread monsoon flow. In the center, great barrays, moats and other reservoirs stored, delayed, redirected and gave meaning to water. To the south, channels distributed it or disposed of excess toward the Tonle Sap. Your circuit crosses only a tiny edge of that organization, yet the rain makes the sequence immediate. You clear no more. The combined current is using the full bed without pressing against a weak outer bend. You turn upstream, following the water back toward the choice you changed. At the junction, the pool holds steady below the grass line. The 2 southern notches carry more water, but their edges have not collapsed. The pond branch is full and smooth. Rain falling directly onto the pond beyond raises its surface independently, reminding you that not every change there comes from your channel. You take a step into the pond branch and feel the bed deepen. The current has room. A low side opening toward the pond itself begins to pass water. You touch the bank beside it and find the soil firm. No action is required. The restraint matters as much as the clearing. A worker moving through a system this connected cannot improve every wet place by making it wider. Some water needs to slow, some needs to stand, some needs to leave. Some routes may be meaningful boundaries as well as practical ones. The purpose of a feature cannot always be read from the fact that water reaches it. A heavier burst strikes the leaves overhead. For a moment the channel surface flattens under the impact. Then the divided currents reappear. You count no formal interval, but remain through several cycles of stronger and lighter rain. The pool rises and falls within the range your small openings can pass. The wrong side of the bank stays quiet. You follow the southern water farther than before. The broad cut gradually turns southwest, taking advantage of the lower plain. In later phases of Angkor's network, channels with this general tendency increasingly served to move excess water away from the central area. Some crossed or reused older alignments. The landscape became a record of additions rather than a clean replacement of one plan by another. You step around a shallow scour where the current has bitten into the inner bend. The exposed soil is compact. Loose grains collect just below it. The rain has not enlarged the cut since your last pass, so you leave it untouched and mark its position by the nearby forked tree in your memory. Farther south, the channel joins a wider depression leading toward fields and lower watercourses. Beyond many such connections lies the Tonle Sap, the Great Lake whose seasonal expansion shapes the wider Cambodian lowlands. Your small release will not travel as one identifiable parcel all the way there. It will mix, stand, soak, evaporate, feed ponds, cross fields, or enter other channels. The network's southward organization describes possibilities and dominant directions, not a single continuous chute. You stop where the bed becomes too broad for this inspection. Water moves without spilling. That is the downstream answer you needed. You turn back in the rain, carrying only the image of the forked tree and the knowledge that the present flow has room. The return walk takes longer because the ground has changed under the rain. A patch that held your weight earlier now slips. You move to the bank crest, where roots offer firmer steps, and keep the basket on the uphill side. Nothing about the task is heroic. Remaining upright is already a respectable contribution to hydraulic order. Near the path, water has begun to run along the wheel ruts and footprints rather than across them. Paths themselves become small channels during rain. Where a rut meets the engineered bed, it delivers a muddy pulse. You scrape a shallow break in the rut, so runoff spreads onto grass before reaching the crossing. The act protects the channel from one concentrated thread without pretending to govern the whole storm. Well, this is how recurring labour sits inside monumental scale. Barrays, moats and long embankments demanded construction on a level associated with rulers and large workforces. Their continued operation depended on repeated local attention, watching a bank, clearing vegetation and sediment, reading a change in level, noticing erosion, and returning after weather. Direct evidence does not tell us which adults performed every task, under what title, or by what schedule. The physical requirements remain. At the crossing, the exposed route is nearly submerged. The path is still above the current. You remove another handful of leaves and look at the joined flow beyond. It has become uniformly brown, the two sources no longer distinguishable. Your action at the junction has propagated this far. So has rain from everywhere else. The distinction between consequence and coincidence grows harder as the storm continues. You accept that limit and return to the point where you can still observe a clear relation: the pool, the openings, and the once whispering bank. The outer face of the bank now carries dozens of rain threads. Most begin at the crest and run over the surface. The old seep began lower, beneath a root, and formed bubbles in a footprint. You crouch at that exact place and use your fingers to shield it again. For several breaths, surface water collects against your knuckles. Beneath them, the damp earth remains still. You remove your hand. The pooled drop slides downhill in one clear line, not from inside the bank. The distinction is small but sufficient. The pressure created by the clogged junction has been relieved for now. Across Greater Angkor, the same storm meets banks of different ages and conditions. Some are massive reservoir embankments. Others are field boundaries, road edges, moat walls, or modest channel ridges. A map gathers them as features. Water distinguishes them by elevation, permeability, connection, and maintenance. Around you, the rain slackens enough for separate drops to reappear on the pool. The two southern notches continue to pass water. The pond branch remains open. No fresh sediment has lodged at the mouths. You straighten slowly. The repair has not mastered the monsoon. It has changed one local balance. The wet season will test it again, perhaps before nightfall. Your task is to decide whether this balance has held long enough to move to the next vulnerable reach. You walk the upper side of the bank once more, this time looking for the source of the weak edge rather than the immediate blockage. The root above the seep belongs to a shrub growing from the crest. Its thicker roots bind the surface. One finer root has died and left a small channel through the outer face. Water backed up at the junction found that ready-made path. Woe to the one herd, you do not pull the living shrub. Removing it in saturated soil could loosen more earth than the fine cavity threatens. Instead, you trim only the loose dead stem lying across the channel and press the cavity from the outer side where it meets the surface. The buried portion remains unknowable. The lowering of the pool is what keeps it from carrying water now. A king's inscription might celebrate a reservoir, a temple, or a gift. It is less likely to preserve the moment when a dead root and a leaf mat conspired against a junction. Yet systems endure or fail through just such ordinary details. You mark the shrub in memory by its split upper branch. On your next circuit, you will look first at the pool level, then at the outer cavity, then at the downstream crossing. The repair now has a sequence for inspection. That sequence belongs to you, not to an invented office or regulation. The sky brightens in the west while rain continues in the north. This unevenness means runoff from the catchment may still increase after the drops around you ease. Water travelling through northern channels and across collection banks does not arrive at every junction at the instant it falls. For you, the delay between rain and arrival is another reason maintenance requires return visits. A local shower can end while upstream water is still assembling. A worker who leaves at the first bright patch may come back to a different channel. The landscape keeps no convenient appointment book. At the junction, the pool rises a little as the delayed flow enters. The pond branch deepens. The southern notches accelerate and begin to erode their soft inner edges. You press no earth into them now, because doing so would raise the pool. Instead, you remove a loose clod from just downstream, allowing the two ribbons to join without striking the side of the bed. The pool stabilizes below the old seep level. On the outer face, the root cavity remains dry beneath surface rain. At the path crossing, the root reference disappears under the current, but the path itself remains clear. You have reached the strongest test so far. The repair is not unchanged. Water has widened it, yet the intended roots are carrying the added flow, and the bank is no longer being asked to serve as an accidental channel. You take the basket downstream and remove the loose clod before it breaks apart. The load is small, mostly wet soil and stems. You place it beyond the path on a firm patch, where runoff does not lead back to the bed. The southern opening now shows a clean, continuous slope from the junction into the first reach. Its shape is not permanent. Tomorrow's water may deposit new silt. A dry interval may harden the edges. Roots may return. Maintenance is not the final completion of a design. It is the repeated work of keeping a root close enough to its intended condition for the present need. You need not use that word at the junction. You see an old bed beneath new sediment, a living root beside a dead cavity, and a fresh cut within a channel older than your own memory. That is the idea in earth. The northern flow begins to fall. Small fragments no longer hurry past your ankle. The pond branch smooths. The southern notches remain open. You rinse your hands in the moving water, then stop before the silt from your fingers reaches the vulnerable mouth. Even cleanliness has a downstream direction here. You move a few steps lower, wash the mud away, and return for one final circuit. The final circuit begins upstream. You check the east-west bank where runoff spreads, the opening that feeds the northern channel, and the grass line along the water. No concentrated overflow has cut across the crest. The current is falling slowly. At the junction, you check the divided roots. The pool sits below the root cavity. The pond branch carries a broad, quiet share. The southern opening passes two joined ribbons through the restored bed. No leaf mat has reformed. At the outer face, you check the pressed patch. It remains damp but still. At the path, you check the crossing. Water remains below the walking surface. At the broader cut, you check the meeting currents. The sediment cloud has passed. At the forked tree, you check the inner bend. The shallow scour has not enlarged. You do not imagine a single centrally dispatched army performing identical rounds. The evidence points to a more varied landscape, with monumental state projects beside local ponds, temple communities, fields, and household decisions. Labor and authority may have differed from place to place and century to century. Your circuit ends where it began, beside the wrong sound. There is no whisper now. Rainwater ticks from leaves. The intended channel murmurs through its open bed. The absence of the first sound is the repair's clearest payoff. You remain long enough to hear whether silence is merely an interval. The bank gives you only the ordinary noises of a wet place. Drops striking broad leaves, water brushing stems, a soft collapse of loosened silt well inside the channel. Nothing presses through the root cavity. From a temple causeway, you might see a water landscape governed by straight lines and royal scale. From here, geometry is always being translated into material. An embankment is a slope that can soften. A canal is a bed that can fill. A gate or opening is a narrow place where leaves gather. A reservoir is a broad level held by many kilometers of bank. The farther a design extends, the more particular surfaces it asks people to revisit. This does not diminish Angkor's achievement. It makes the achievement human. Khmer builders shaped streams, dug channels, raised embankments, formed reservoirs and moats, and integrated these works with settlements, temples, fields, and roads. The landscape was neither discovered by outsiders nor left by an inexplicable vanished people. Cambodian communities and institutions continue to live with and conserve its water today. Your own moment remains medieval and modest. You lift the basket, now lighter but no cleaner. The removed leaf mat has begun to sag on firm ground. You spread it thinner so it will not slide back as one mass. The sky opens in a pale strip beyond the trees. Upstream water continues to arrive, but at a falling rate. You decide the junction can be left for the length of a walk to the next bank. That is not confidence in permanence. It is confidence in the evidence presently under your hand and feet. Before leaving, you follow the pond branch to its local edge. The pond has risen under direct rain and channel inflow. Its overflow lip remains above the surface. The path beside it is soft but passable. A person carrying a covered basket chooses the higher side and continues without stepping into water. That ordinary passage answers one of the competing needs you considered earlier. The pond has received water without losing the path. The southern route has received enough to relieve the bank without overtopping its crossing. The balance may not suit every future rain, but it has suited this one. A small current enters the pond through grass. It leaves a fan of fine sediment on the edge. You notice the deposit because it may narrow the inlet over time. Today it is too slight to remove in the rain. You mark it by a flat stone already beside the path and add the pond edge to your next circuit. Maintenance creates memory. The split shrub marks the seep. The exposed root marks the crossing. The forked tree marks the scour. The flat stone marks fresh sediment. None is an official measuring device. Together they let one person return to changing places and compare them with what was seen before. You turn from the pond. The monumental network beyond remains invisible, but your limited view now contains 4 consequences of one adjustment, each quiet enough to be overlooked and useful enough to matter. You can now answer the title from the bank rather than from a distant survey. Greater Angkor's mapped water landscape extended through northern catchments and collectors, central barrays and moats, local ponds and channels, and southern distributors and drains across more than 1,000 square kilometers. Within a wider archaeological region mapped over nearly 3,000 square kilometers, it formed the most extensive known pre-industrial urban complex. That is the grounded superlative. It concerns mapped scale and integration, not a precise measurement proving that Angkor pushed more liters per day than every city that came before. Ancient systems leave different evidence, operated in different seasons, and cannot be entered into one reliable global table. The careful wording is not a retreat. A network exceeding 1,000 square kilometers, built and altered before modern engines, is extraordinary without invented arithmetic. You see its logic in miniature. Water has come from higher ground, met a collecting bank, entered a north-south route, divided near habitation and a moat, and continued toward lower channels. The sequence links your hand to a landscape larger than any one worker could inspect. It also explains why scale did not remove maintenance. More connections meant more places where sediment, erosion, vegetation, and changed alignments could matter. A useful diversion here altered the flow at a path, a joining channel, and a pond. The repair succeeded because you followed those consequences, not because you forced all water into one direction. You set the basket on your hip and face the next reach. Behind you, the repaired junction carries the diminishing runoff. The title has been paid off, but the rain has not finished with the landscape. A final dark band crosses the northern sky. The second burst arrives harder than the first, drumming on the pond and flattening the channel surface. You return 3 quick steps to the junction, not because the repair has failed, but because a repair deserves to meet the weather that justified it. The northern flow rises. The pond branch deepens. The southern opening takes a broad sheet through the two notches, which have merged into one shallow mouth. Water touches the lower edge of the grass line, but remains below the root cavity. For a moment, loose stems gather at the entrance. You lift them with one hand and let clean water pass beneath. The repair changes shape under the rain, yet continues to serve. That is enough. You press no new barrier into the current. You do not attempt mastery over the storm. You keep the opening free and wait until the strongest sound moves south. When the rain eases, the pool falls first at the junction, then beside the pond. The bank face remains wet and silent. One hard rain has passed through the intended roots. The modest repair has held, not as a monument, but as an interval of useful order. You leave the split shrub, exposed root, forked tree, and flat stone behind as points for the return journey. The basket hangs empty at your side. Water still moves around your ankles, but no longer searches through the bank. The next vulnerable place lies west, where a larger embankment meets an inlet associated with one of the great reservoirs. You cannot see the whole beret from the junction. From its bank, a person can look across water and still fail to understand the slight gradients and hidden blockages that determine where the surface goes next. You choose the higher footpath and begin walking. Behind you, the pond settles below its overflow. The causeway reflects in the moat again as the wind weakens. Southward channels carry the remaining brown water across the plain. Northward, runoff continues to gather in shaded cuts. Nothing has been finished forever. The bank will need another touch after more rain. Vegetation will return. Silt will settle where the current slows. A downstream need may change. The next inspection may produce a different decision. For now, you hear no wrong sound. One intended opening remains clear. One crossing is passable. One rain has travelled through without enlarging the weak place. The landscape ahead grows broader, the slope gentler, and the geometry more ambitious. You follow the footpath toward the reservoir embankment, where a ruler's clean rectangle meets the same uncooperative earth. The footpath rises onto the western reservoir bank, and the intimate sounds of the junction fall away. Water and sky now occupy most of the view. You follow another adult Khmer worker, again a careful composite rather than a named person, whose task combines the practical attention of a surveyor, supervisor, and member of a work gang. The sources do not preserve one exact office for this scene. Before you lies the West Barry, the Great Western Reservoir. Its long rectangle stretches roughly 8 kilometers from east to west, and a little more than 2 kilometers across. The far bank is distant enough to soften in haze. From the crest, royal geometry seems to have won. Your ordinary goal is to understand the difference before a work gang moves earth in the wrong place. You walk the crest and compare the bank, inlet direction, water edge, and lower roots. No surviving document tells us the exact signals your composite uses. The reservoir itself provides them. A wet stain higher on one section, sediment fanning from an entry, reeds bent by a current, and still water where a diagram would suggest movement. A ruler may order straight embankments. The slope beneath them remains under no obligation to admire the drawing. You descend toward the uneven waterline and begin with the place where grass has stopped drifting. At the inner toe of the bank, you can no longer take in the reservoir as one shape. The horizon disappears behind reeds and the raised earth above you. The West Barry becomes a sequence of surfaces, compact ground underfoot, a shelf of soft sediment, shallow water, and the slope of the embankment. You push a floating stem away from the quiet tongue. It moves a short distance and stops. The water here is almost level, but almost is the important word. Across a shallow plain, slight differences in elevation determine whether a current continues, spreads, or loses enough energy to deposit what it carries. The Beret is not a natural lake simply enclosed by a wall. Its banks, inlets, outlets, and connections were built and changed within a larger network. Water could enter from channels linked to northern catchments. It could be retained, redistributed, or released through routes whose phases and functions are only partly understood. The reservoir's scale magnified the consequences of small gradients. You scrape a narrow line through the fresh sediment with your heel. Clearer water enters it from the east, showing that the surface falls by a tiny amount in that direction at this point. The line is not an intervention, only a test that the next ripple erases. You climb back to the crest and walk toward the inlet side, keeping the quiet tongue aligned with a distant tree so you can find it again. As you walk, the reservoir's meaning travels beside its material form. Large Angkorian berets have long stood at the center of debate. Some interpretations emphasize irrigation and agricultural storage. Others point to political display, urban supply, flood management, or ritual geography. Scholars increasingly resist forcing these possibilities into a single choice. A beret could participate in sacred order and still hold real monsoon water. A temple moat could mark a meaningful boundary and also receive or release flow. Uses might vary by place, season, and century. Physical connections show that water could move. They do not, on their own, reveal the balance among every intended purpose. You pass a point from which an island temple near the reservoir's center can be glimpsed. Its position gives the broad water a ceremonial focus. At your feet, a crab has opened a small hole in the wet bank. The sacred landscape and the practical bank occupy the same view without cancelling one another. This is how the story will keep the debate audible. You do not choose ritual over function, or function over ritual, merely because your task concerns flow. You follow the evidence that can change your next action. The sediment fan suggests an inlet current has slowed and dropped part of its load. If that deposit grows, it may redirect water along the bank rather than into the reservoir body. You angle down from the crest to inspect its edge. Before you, the fan begins as a broad patch of fine sand and silt, barely raised above the surrounding shelf. Near its upstream edge, water runs over it in thin braided threads. At the downstream edge, reeds have taken root in the slower water. The deposit is recent at the surface, though older layers may lie beneath. An inlet does more than deliver water. It delivers sediment carried from upstream. When the current spreads into a broad reservoir, it slows, and some of that material settles. Over years, such deposition can alter depths and routes. The West Beret's sediment record shows that its hydrological history changed substantially. It was not a fixed basin operating in the same way for centuries. You watch the threads cross the fan. Most turn south along its outer edge. Only one continues west into deeper water. That explains the quiet tongue near the bank. The deposit is encouraging incoming flow to hug the margin. The condition is not solved by cutting a deep trench through the fan. Such work would require a larger decision and more evidence. Your immediate goal is to determine whether the margin route is blocked farther along. You mark the thickest part with a reed laid flat above the waterline, then follow the south-turning threads toward an older channel mouth. You find the older mouth as a broad indentation in the bankside shelf. Its center is open, but the approach is shallow. Water from the sediment fan reaches it obliquely, loses speed, and spreads among reeds before entering. From the crest, the line seemed direct. At ground level, it has become a slow curve. You wade to the opening and lift a cluster of dead stems. Beneath them lies firmer bed and a narrow current. The stems have trapped enough silt to raise the approach, not enough to seal it. You hand the cluster to a waiting worker, who places it on dry ground. The West Beret's enormous proportions can make each local obstacle seem ridiculous. The reservoir has several square kilometers of surface, and yet a person is once again arguing with vegetation at ankle depth. Scale does not abolish repetition. It supplies repetition with a longer bank. You remove no living reeds. Their roots may help hold the edge, and their full effect is uncertain. Instead, you clear the dead mat from the existing opening and watch the current strengthen. Water that had travelled along the inner bank now enters the mouth more directly. You signal the gang to move only the loose mat and surface silt from the approach. No one cuts a new alignment. The work remains small against the reservoir, which is precisely why it can be done without pretending the whole system has been understood. Around you, baskets pass from the shallow water to the bank. Each contains wet stems and a little silt. The adults work in a short line because the inner slope is too soft for many feet at once. We cannot assign them a documented gang name, quota, or labour obligation. The scene keeps only what the physical work requires. Several bodies can move loose material more safely and steadily than one. You remain at the opening. With each load, the current becomes easier to see. It crosses the cleared approach, enters the older mouth, and lowers the quiet water along the bank by a small amount. A reed that had stood motionless begins to lean. The embankment above is the reservoir's monumental fact. It encloses water over a vast distance and represents organized labor on a royal scale. Yet an earthen bank is not one uniform object. Construction materials vary. Later repairs alter sections. Rain, waves, roots, paths, and settlement affect surfaces differently. Inspecting a 22-kilometer circuit, as the West Barre's modern dikes roughly form, is not the same as admiring a rectangle on a map. You climb partway up the slope and look for seepage opposite the newly strengthened current. The soil is damp from rain but shows no focused outflow. That means the immediate concern remains movement along the inner margin, not water passing through the main bank. You walk toward the northeastern part of the reservoir, where mapped channels indicate an important inlet connection. The route associated with the West Barre is broad enough in places to be a landscape feature, not a ditch. One mapped inlet channel near the northeastern corner is about 25 meters wide, though its exact operation changed over time. From the bank, you see how incoming water must cross a difficult transition. A confined channel can carry a directed current. A reservoir spreads that current across a broad, shallow margin. If the entry alignment, level, or bed changes, water may turn along the bank, deposit sediment, or fail to reach the areas expected. The inlet before you is not full. Rain has raised its surface, but reeds mark older margins above it. Water enters the reservoir in a fan, confirming what you saw farther west. The strongest thread follows a slightly deeper line. Another curls toward the bankside shelf. You step onto a firm projection and compare the two. Floating fragments travel faster in the deeper thread, then slow as the reservoir widens. The bankside thread carries more suspended soil. It is the likely source of the fresh fan. No action here can remove sediment already delivered from the catchment. Upstream conditions matter. A bank that spreads water in the northern zone, a channel cut, or erosion along a route may change the load reaching the Barre. The connected network makes the inlet a receiver of distant events. There is no gate visible at this inlet in your present scene. Angkor's waterworks included openings, channels, banks, and features interpreted as control points, but their precise superstructures and operating methods are not uniformly preserved. You avoid furnishing the place with a mechanism merely because a modern diagram would benefit from one. Instead, you follow the deeper thread upstream along the channel edge. A low bar of sediment crosses part of the bed. It does not block the current. It shifts the fastest water north, so that the entry meets the reservoir at a slight angle. The fan beyond is a downstream expression of that angle. You place the straight branch across the surface and sight along the existing bank. The cleanest alignment would pass through the low bar, but removing it could release more sediment and change the inlet abruptly. The gentler option is to open a narrow path along the bar's southern edge, restoring part of the older direction while leaving most of the deposit stable. Two workers enter the shallow channel. They lift only loose material from the edge you indicate, and carry it to firm ground outside the active bed. The action is plausible staging based on the physical demand, not a claim about a recorded procedure. You remain where the current enters the reservoir and watch for change. The first release arrives as a clearer tongue. It travels farther west before spreading. The bankside thread weakens but does not disappear. That is preferable to a dramatic switch. Water now uses two routes, one carrying more of the current into open space, the other still wetting the margin. You return toward the earlier channel mouth while the work gang follows along the crest. The walk is long enough for the reservoir to lose its first impression of stillness. Wind pushes small waves against the inner bank. Inlets create local currents. Reeds bend in one direction, then another. The surface is a field of movements rather than a single level. At the marked sediment fan, you see the new inlet tongue cut a faint line across the upper layer. More water now travels into the reservoir body before turning. The margin still receives flow, but the quiet tongue has shortened. At the older mouth, the cleared approach remains open. The reservoir has accepted the adjustment without becoming tidy. The uncooperative slope has merely moved from open disagreement to reserved criticism. You need this distinction when reading ancient features. A reservoir's capacity, its average level, an inlet's performance, and a particular outlet's condition are related but not interchangeable. Sediment cores record conditions at sampled locations. Maps show surviving form. Neither offers a continuous daily log. You lift the read marker from the fan, so it will not become part of the next blockage. The gang carries the last loose material away from the active edge. Your attention turns to the larger question of where water could leave, because an inlet that works well only transfers the problem if the outlet cannot respond. The West Baray did not begin Angkor's history of large waterworks. Earlier systems developed around Rolios, southeast of the later central complex, in the 9th century. The East Baray followed in the late 9th century as the political and monumental centre shifted. The West Baray was added later, probably in the 11th century. Within a landscape already crossed by channels, banks, temples, fields, and settlements. You hold this chronology while walking, not as a roll call of royal projects, but as an explanation for intersecting lines. Each major addition inherited older water moving across the plain. New embankments redirected routes, inlets tied reservoirs to catchments, outlets had to meet lower channels. Later works near Angkor Thom and Angkor Wat changed the central arrangement again. You descend to inspect a low depression interpreted as part of an outlet or distribution route. Water stands in its upper reach, but does not move. A mat of living reeds fills the center. The lower bed is obscured by silt. The condition could indicate a blocked outlet, an inactive feature from another phase, a route meant to operate only at a higher level, or a misreading of its function. You cannot decide by desire. A neat story would call for opening it. A careful worker first checks whether the lower channel is continuous, and whether the reservoir water presently reaches the sill. You walk around the reeds rather than through them, searching for the lowest visible connection. You find a narrow notch at the depression's southern side, leading into a channel descending from the reservoir. Its bed is dry beyond the first few steps. The standing water among the reeds lies below the notch. Whatever this feature once did, it cannot release the present reservoir level through that opening without another connection. You crouch and compare the damp stains. An older line on the reeds stands higher, showing that water has reached the notch at some earlier time. The dry channel beyond contains fine sediment but no fresh debris. It may function only during higher water, or it may belong to a phase when the reservoir and outlet were configured differently. This is the alignment that refuses to behave like a diagram. The map shows a connection. The ground shows a threshold. Hydraulic modeling could test what water level would be required to cross it. Excavation might reveal construction episodes. Neither gives you permission to cut through the sill today. The decision is modest. No outlet work until the relation between water level and sill can be observed. A supervisor who orders digging merely to make the line on the map come true would be converting uncertainty into a channel. You climb back to the crest. The reservoir continues receiving water through the adjusted inlet. If the level rises enough, this notch may begin to operate. If it does not, another outlet route must carry the present inflow. Your next walk follows the southern bank toward those lower connections. Under your feet, the southern embankment runs straight enough to impress and irregularly enough to occupy every step. On the reservoir side, wavelets cut small scallops into soft patches. On the outer side, paths descend toward fields and channels. Some stretches are dry, others carry dark stains where rain has soaked through the surface without forming a focused seep. You pause at each concentrated wet place. Most prove to be runoff from the crest. One begins below a clump of roots, but no water emerges when you shield it. You note the location and move on. A great bank asks for many negative findings, places inspected because they might be failing and found, for the moment, not to be. These additions did not simply enlarge storage, they rearranged routes through a central zone already crowded with earlier works. A channel serving one phase might become drainage in another. A river course could be altered. Water arriving from the north encountered successive barriers, openings, and destinations. You look down the outer slope toward a southward channel. Its bed is wet and carries a slow current away from the reservoir area. That movement may be linked to an outlet farther east, to local runoff, or to another branch. You cannot assign its source from this point. The bank inspection continues. Royal chronology gives you reasons for complexity. Your feet supply the evidence one damp patch at a time. Near the eastern end of the southern bank, you see Angkor's central monuments across the open view. The moat around Angkor Wat lies beyond fields and habitation traces. Its broad rectangle participates in the temple's sacred design, yet later landscape evidence also shows channels and drainage crossing or cutting earlier planned grids. The Siem Reap River, in its present central course, appears to postdate parts of Angkor Wat's initial enclosure layout. It became a major drainage line through the area. That example cautions against treating every visible channel as part of the first plan. Water landscapes are historical documents with revisions. Or follow a lower distributary, where water leaves the reservoir margin and enters a south-oriented channel. The current is stronger than in the dry notch you marked. Its bed contains fresh leaves, which indicate recent flow. The banks show no overtopping. At a narrow section, a fallen branch has caught debris. You and one worker lift the branch together, turning it parallel to the bank before carrying it clear. The debris releases in a soft pulse. You wait downstream until it spreads and no longer threatens the next bend. This is one outlet route behaving as a route. It does not prove the purpose or date of the dry depression behind you. Several exits may have served different levels, seasons, or phases. Some may be later drains rather than original reservoir outlets. You mark the branch site in memory and begin the return along the bank, carrying a more complicated answer than the clean rectangle promised. The reservoir story might be told as the work of kings, because the embankments are immense and royal foundations shaped Angkor's monumental center. That perspective is necessary and insufficient. Large state-sponsored works existed within a landscape of community temples, local reservoirs, ponds, fields, and habitation mounds. Spatial studies suggest that temple communities clustered around hydraulic features and could use state infrastructure, while retaining some local control over land and agricultural practice. This is a model built from archaeological patterns and inscriptions, not a complete account of daily administration. It argues against imagining every gate and pond operated from one central command. You see the mixture along the outer bank. A major embankment defines the reservoir. Below it, narrow channels enter field edges. A small pond sits beside a raised mound. A path crosses a drainage line at a point maintained by whoever needs the crossing. The monumental and local systems touch without becoming identical. At the path, water has collected against a clump of grass. You pull the loose stems free and allow the puddle to drain into the existing ditch. No one needs to invoke the reservoir's royal sponsor for this domestic-scale correction. At the same time, the ditch's level depends partly on the Great Bank above. You step back onto the crest. The adjusted inlet, cleared channel mouth, dry threshold, and active southern route now form one working picture. None behaves alone, and none permits a single story of control. You return to the sediment fan as the afternoon light settles lower. The work gang has left the active edge undisturbed since your signal. Water still follows the narrow path opened along the upstream bar and travels farther into the reservoir before spreading. The bankside thread remains, but it carries less suspended soil. You ask the simplest available question. Has the adjustment reduced the quiet water at the older mouth without creating a sharper current against the embankment? The answer requires another walk between the two places. At the inlet fan, you see the current point west. Along the inner bank, it slows. At the older mouth, water enters through the cleared approach. On the embankment opposite, no focused seep appears. The small sequence fits. Arula's reservoir has therefore submitted its afternoon report in the form of wet reeds, a branch knot, and several walks. It is not an efficient filing system, but it is difficult to forge. Behind you, the gang carries the removed stems away from the bank. Loose silt is spread where rain cannot immediately return it to the inlet. No one enlarges the opening further. The current is strong enough to maintain the narrow path by itself. You lift the straight branch from the water. Its knot has served as a local reference, not a measurement for an inscription. You place it beside the reed marker and walk toward the dry outlet threshold once more, because the reservoir level has had time to rise. At the threshold, you find standing water at the first stone, but still below the notch. The reeds are wet higher than before from rain and wind, so their surface stain is less useful. The sill itself remains clear. You kneel and look along the dry channel beyond. Its bed falls gently, then disappears behind a low rise. If water crosses the notch, it should move away. The physical possibility is visible. The present connection is not active. This distinction mirrors a larger research caution. Modern conservation has repaired canals and dikes at Angkor and restored flow through ancient routes. Such work demonstrates that a route can carry water when cleared, reconnected, or supplied at a suitable level. It does not reveal the exact medieval governance, operating schedule, or original balance of functions. A successful modern flow is evidence about possibility, not a diary from the past. Your composite worker knows only the immediate version. A dry channel below a sill may become useful later, but cutting the sill now would impose a new level on the reservoir. You leave it. For you, the decision solves no dramatic mystery. It prevents an unsupported action. Maintenance sometimes consists of knowing which apparent blockage is actually a threshold, and which threshold belongs to another condition. Behind you, the west beret holds a broad surface under fading light. At one edge, the inlet adjustment continues. At another, a southward route carries water away. Here, the dry notch waits for a level it has not yet received. The reservoir works through differences rather than one command. The walk westward takes you past the long line of the embankment again. You notice where the crest changes width and where later work may have strengthened a softer section. Earthworks this large were not necessarily completed in one uniform episode. Construction, repair, and reuse can leave overlapping forms. You descend at a place where a shallow cross-channel meets the outer bank. The junction is partly filled with fine sediment. Unlike the dry outlet threshold, this bed is wet on both sides and carries a continuous trickle. The blockage is therefore active. You clear the surface layer with your hands while another worker holds the basket. Water joins across the opening and carries a small plume south. You stop before reaching the firm base. The task takes only a few moments. The contrast with the reservoir's monumental scale is useful. Successive networks were not maintained only through equally monumental projects. They also required many small corrections at the places where alignments met. You climb back to the crest and look across the beret. The geometric outline remains, but your route around it has accumulated an inlet fan, a cleared mouth, an inactive threshold, an active southward channel, a damp bank, and a minor cross-drain. The rectangle now contains enough local evidence to resist every simple explanation offered from a distance. Near the western end, you find shallower water and a bed supporting more vegetation. Sediment cores taken in modern research from the West Beret show that depositional conditions changed over time. In the 14th century, rates recorded at one sampled location diminished sharply. That finding has been discussed alongside regional drought and changing use of the reservoir. A core is a narrow history. It records layers beneath one place. It cannot tell you how every shore behaved, who cleared an inlet, or why a political center changed. You return at once to the composite worker, who sees the practical counterpart. Broad, shallow water can leave large areas sensitive to modest changes in level. The reservoir has spent the day refusing to become one problem. Its objections are distributed with admirable fairness. You examine the outer bank opposite the shallow shelf. It remains dry below the rain-dark surface. The local condition is stable enough that no gang work is needed. Your useful finding is negative. This reach is shallow and vegetated, but not presently backing water against a vulnerable bank or blocking a necessary route. You turn east again. The day has produced a series of limited decisions rather than one triumphant correction. That is appropriate. Sediment history, water level, and network chronology all warn against making a single afternoon stand for centuries of use. Modern Cambodian conservation offers a different kind of evidence at Angkor. Apacera National Authority and its partners have rehabilitated old channels and dikes, reflooded parts of reservoirs, and restored circulation in sections of the water landscape. At the West Beret, modern work has helped retain and distribute water through a vast surviving embankment circuit. The result is important and bounded. When a repaired ancient route carries water, it confirms that the geometry and gradients can function under the restored conditions. It does not prove that medieval workers used the same sluices, schedules, authority, or technical sequence. Restoration demonstrates physical possibility and continuing stewardship, not a complete recovery of original purpose. You stand again above the inlet fan. In the medieval frame, the small adjustment has held for the day. In the modern aside, the broader landscape remains a place where Cambodian institutions and communities manage real water rather than contemplate a dead ruin. The two moments touch through the bank but must not be collapsed into one procedure. You descend to lift the reed marker and branch from the shelf. Nothing artificial is left in the channel. Water follows the path it has begun to maintain through the loose deposit. The older mouth receives the margin flow. The southward channel continues beyond the embankment. You look toward the dry threshold. Its stones remain above water. That alignment still refuses to operate, and its refusal has become the most honest feature in the day's account. You find the payoff in the mismatch between scale and certainty. The Great Berets were monumental nodes in Angkor's changing water landscape. They could receive and redirect monsoon flow, connect with channels and moats, hold water across enormous surfaces, support practical needs, and embody ritual and political meanings. The evidence does not require one function to erase the others. Their size did not make them automatic. A shallow gradient could misdirect an inlet. Sediment could form a fan. Vegetation could narrow a mouth. An outlet could wait above the current level. A later channel could cross an earlier plan. Understanding the reservoir meant walking between these particulars and resisting the urge to turn every wet line into a working connection. You make one last circuit of the active points. The inlet tongue remains aligned farther into open water. The margin thread has weakened. The older mouth is clear. The southern route carries a steady current. The dry notch remains dry. No new seep has appeared on the embankment. The work gang begins down the outer slope toward habitation mounds and ponds below. You follow, leaving the high crest and its distant horizon. The reservoir broadens behind you, still geometric enough to belong to a ruler's landscape and irregular enough to occupy generations of workers. At the foot of the bank, you see a small pond catch the last light. Its edge is close enough for one household to cross in a few steps. The next water problem will fit inside that distance. You leave the reservoir with the branch laid aside and the baskets empty of silt. The broad bank hides the water as soon as the path bends. What remains audible is a small overflow beside the footpath and the evening movement of people returning among raised mounds. One adult pauses at a pond edge. This person too will be a careful composite, because archaeology preserves the mound, depression, paths, plant remains, and domestic traces more readily than a named household's daily account. The goal is smaller than a barre, and no less real. Keep the pond approach and nearby runoff usable as the wet season begins to loosen its hold. You step down from the final embankment slope. The ground beside the pond is soft where feet converge. A narrow path passes between the water and a field boundary. A community shrine stands within the neighborhood landscape, close enough to belong to ordinary movement rather than a distant ceremonial horizon. Behind you, the Uncooperative reservoir holds its mixed answer. Sacred and practical, royal and local, connected and repeatedly altered. Ahead, a basket rests beside a mound where an organic house leaves little visible trace. The light is lower now. Direct address can begin to soften, but the action continues. You follow the resident toward the pond, where a domestic consequence will matter more than the shape of an empire. The resident steps from the raised mound with a basket in one hand and pauses where the footpath narrows beside the pond. You are still close enough to share the first inspection, though the story will gradually allow this adult a little more distance. Like the workers before, the resident is a composite built from documented landscape features and domestic evidence, not a named person recovered from a diary. The pond surface is high from the wet season, but the rain has begun to arrive less often. The dark line on the bank shows where water stood earlier. Below it, exposed mud is soft enough to take a footprint and firm enough to hold it. The path between pond and field has slumped toward the water at one point. The ordinary goal is immediate. Keep the approach usable, prevent runoff from cutting the footpath, and leave the pond edge able to serve household needs as the water recedes. No imperial crisis enters the task. A basket must be carried without sliding into the pond. Feet need a dry line between mound, field, and shrine. You place the basket on the raised side and press the slumped edge with your heel. Water appears in the footprint, then sinks back. A shallow groove from the path points directly into the pond, carrying loose soil with every shower. The groove is small, but if it deepens, the walking surface will narrow. Most houses in Angkor's residential landscape were built from organic materials that have not survived, like the stone temples. Posts, floors, walls and roofs decay. What remains more visible are the raised mounds on which people lived, the ponds beside them, earthen paths, field boundaries, channels, ceramics, plant remains, and deposits uncovered by excavation. The disappearing house explains why a visitor who looks only for stone can mistake the temple for the whole city. Greater Angkor was inhabited across a broad, low-density landscape. Ponds and mounds repeat beyond the monumental enclosures, connected by paths and fields that made the spaces between temples part of urban life. But, at the pond edge, you lift a loose clod from the slumped path. It contains roots from grass that once held the surface. The wet season has undercut them. You set the clod on the higher side, where it can dry rather than fall into the water. The resident's task is therefore both simple and evidential. Repairing a footpath beside a pond is plausible because those features survive in close association. The exact person, household arrangement, and routine remain unknowable. You keep the action within that boundary and follow the groove uphill to see where runoff gathers. The groove begins beside the mound where roof runoff and yard water meet the path. Its upper end is shallow, scarcely more than a repeated line made by falling water. Lower down, feet have deepened it. Each step taken in the same soft place has encouraged the next shower to choose that route. You scrape loose soil from the groove and spread it over a wider patch of grass. The aim is not to stop rain but to make it arrive at the pond less like a narrow tool. A concentrated thread carries soil. A thin sheet loses more of its force before reaching the path. The basket remains at the pond edge, waiting with the quiet confidence of an object that has never had to cross its own slippery approach. That is the single dry observation this later story needs. The resident lifts 2 flat pieces of firm earth from the mound side and places them where the path has slumped. No paved road is invented. The pieces merely restore a stable step on an existing earthen surface. Water from a small poured cup would make a convenient test, but we do not know that this was the method used. Instead, the resident waits for the next natural trickle from wet leaves and presses the surface with a bare foot. The runoff spreads before it reaches the repaired step. At the waterline, old leaves form a dark band. Some float free when touched, others are worked into fine mud. The resident removes only the loose material from the place where feet approach, leaving rooted plants along the rest of the bank. A local pond is not a reduced version of the West Baray. Its catchment is immediate. Rain falls from roofs and trees, crosses the mound, and enters from nearby ground. The pond may also interact with a ditch or channel, but its daily usefulness depends on its own bank, depth, and access. Archaeology maps thousands of such ponds across Greater Angkor. Their abundance helps correct the picture of a city managed solely through royal reservoirs. Each pond created a small water space near habitation, and each would have developed local problems of sediment, vegetation, erosion, and seasonal change. The resident fills the basket with leaves and lifts it to the higher bank. Water drains through the weave. The exposed approach is still muddy, but no thick mat rolls underfoot. A narrow shelf becomes visible just below the surface. Across the pond, a path continues toward another mound. No wall separates one household's runoff from the neighborhood's lower ground. Local decisions sit beside one another, connected by the same slight slope that governed the great channels. The pond's practical meanings can be described without assigning an exact list of uses to this household. Water close to habitation could support washing, plants, animals, craft, or other domestic needs. It could receive runoff and provide a wet season store into the drier months. The evidence rarely allows every activity at every pond to be specified. You therefore follow what the resident can see. The surface is receding. A recent high water stain lies above the present line. Fine sediment has settled near the inflow groove. The path edge is soft. These conditions require attention, regardless of which cup, pot, plant, or animal will use the water later. At the pond, a small depression on the field side holds water separately from the main basin. If left, it may become a soft trap beside the path. The resident opens a hand-width connection through loose surface mud, allowing the puddle to drain gently into the pond. The cut follows the existing fall and does not alter the main bank. Water moves through the opening, carrying a faint cloud. When the cloud clears, the puddle is shallower and the path has more firm ground beside it. The consequence is domestic. A person can now walk around the pond without stepping into hidden mud. No reservoir level changes. No royal channel turns. One household route becomes usable. The field boundary begins a few steps beyond the repaired path. It is a low ridge rather than a high wall, enough to separate plots and influence shallow runoff. Water stands on one side and drains more quickly on the other. The resident follows the ridge toward a small channel. The channel beside this field carries only a thin wet season remainder. It meets the pond's overflow depression at an angle. A plug of grass at the meeting point slows both. the resident lifts the loose upper stems but leaves the rooted ridge intact. Water resumes a narrow passage along the field edge. This action introduces a complication. Improving drainage from the field can send more water toward the pond. Keeping the pond full can hold moisture against the path. A local solution works only if the three surfaces are considered together. The resident walks back to the pond and watches the inlet. The added thread is small. It enters below the repaired approach and does not erode the step. The pond surface barely changes. You can feel direct address receding as the adult's own circuit becomes established. The person checks mound, path, pond and field in a sequence as practical as the earlier worker's circuit, but the consequences remain within the neighborhood. Beyond the field stands a community shrine, a small temple whose durable remains are modest beside the great royal monuments. Hundreds of community temples were distributed across Angkor's settlement landscape. Many were associated with ponds, moats, occupation mounds and fields. Their presence helps explain how local and larger systems could overlap. A temple community might draw upon a state-built channel or reservoir while maintaining nearby land and water features through local arrangements. Spatial patterns suggest such relationships, though they do not reveal a complete administrative structure. The resident passes the shrine on the way to the lower end of the field channel. No ritual is invented for the moment. The shrine is part of the route, a familiar durable point among more perishable homes. A pond beside it holds water at a different level from the household pond, showing that close features need not behave identically. At the lower channel, a bank from a broader route crosses the neighborhood edge. Its elevation influences local drainage. When the larger channel is high, water can back toward the field. When it falls, the small channel can empty more readily. Today, the broader route is low enough to receive the field trickle. The resident clears one loose stem from the mouth and watches the water pass. The state-scale and local-scale landscapes meet in this narrow opening, but authority does not become visible with the current. The adult turns homeward. The field edge is draining, the pond approach is firmer, and no action has been taken beyond the limits of what can be observed. Within Angkor Wat's enclosure, LiDAR revealed a particularly regular pattern of blocks, occupation mounds and ponds. Many blocks were roughly 100 meters on a side, often with 4 mounds and a pond toward the northeast. The pattern shows planning at a neighborhood scale within the Great Temple boundary. The resident in this story is not assigned to one excavated block. The repeated arrangement offers a grounded model for proximity. A house mound, pond, path, and neighboring mounds can stand within a short walk of one another. Organic buildings have gone, but the earth retains their spatial relationships. Walking around the household pond, the adult sees another mound across the water and a path entering from the east. Runoff from that path has formed a small fan at the pond edge. Its sediment is firmer than the dark leaf band and does not need removal today. The resident tests the eastern path with a foot. It is firm. The new fan has not narrowed the approach. No work is added merely to make the pond edge symmetrical. That choice matters. Archaeological regularity can tempt a narrator to imagine identical homes performing identical routines. The evidence supports repeated forms, not uniform lives. The resident returns to the repaired western step, where the practical measure is simply whether the basket can pass without the carrier sliding toward the water. Back on the mound, rice husk fragments cling to a working surface in the staged domestic area. Excavations within Angkor Wat's enclosure have recovered rice spikelet bases and husks that indicate rice processing on site. This evidence brings an ordinary activity into a landscape once described mainly through temples and kings. The resident lifts a shallow basket of grain and sets it beneath the roof edge, away from the runoff groove. No exact processing technique is narrated beyond what the plant remains support. The important consequence is spatial. Domestic work happens on the mound, and keeping the path and pond edge usable supports movement between water, field and house. A few husk fragments lie near the upper end of the groove. The adult sweeps them toward dry ground with a bundle of stems. Left in the runoff, they could travel to the pond and join the decaying band just removed. The quantity is small, yet household surfaces repeatedly feed nearby water. The resident carries the empty grain basket down the repaired step. The footing holds. At the shelf below the surface, 1 foot can be placed without sinking deeply. Water is reached, and the basket is rinsed, then lifted clear before loose mud enters it. The adult returns uphill along the same line. A domestic task that would have been awkward at the story's beginning is now ordinary again. Plant remains from excavated occupation areas also suggest household horticulture. Bananas, palm, black and long pepper, crepe ginger, and cotton appear among the broader evidence, though no single garden can be reconstructed in full, and some foods may have arrived from elsewhere. Near the mound, the resident checks a small planted patch where useful vegetation grows above the wettest ground. The story does not claim each named species stands here at once. It keeps the supported idea that domestic cultivation occupied space beside habitation and required water at a manageable scale. A shallow channel from the pond side ends before the plants. Its bed is damp, but not flowing. The resident loosens no new connection. With the wet season only beginning to recede, the soil still holds moisture. Sending pond water into the patch would be unnecessary and might soften the mound edge. This decision shows that water management includes withholding action. A nearby store does not mean every surface should be connected. The pond can remain a reserve while rain moisture is sufficient. The adult presses soil around one plant where runoff has exposed a root, using earth from the dry side of the mound. The repair is small and domestic. It changes neither field nor pond level. The wet to dry seasonal turn is gradual. A pond that seemed full after rain can lose surface area over weeks. Field channels stop running. Mud hardens into cracked shelves. Paths become firmer, then dusty. Household decisions change with the same water body rather than shifting into a separate dry season world. The resident notes where the pond's present edge lies below the high stain. The cleared approach reaches deep enough that water remains accessible if the surface falls a little farther. The shelf underfoot, however, may become exposed and slippery with fine sediment before it dries. A second loose mat of leaves floats toward the approach. The adult draws it aside with a branch and places it in the basket. Rooted vegetation remains around the rest of the bank, reducing bare erosion. The goal is a usable entry, not a cleared ring. Along the field boundary, the small channel is almost still. Its connection to the broader route remains open. No more clearing is needed. The resident presses one soft place in the path with the heel, then chooses not to add earth while it is saturated. Material placed now would spread underfoot and narrow the pond edge. The adult sets the branch beside the basket and sits briefly on the mound edge, not to turn the story into a meditation, but to watch whether the newly spread runoff line sends soil toward the path as water drains from leaves. A final thread descends from the roof side. It reaches the place where the concentrated groove was broken and divides across grass. Most soaks into the mound slope. A smaller part enters the pond above the repaired step as a clear sheet rather than a muddy line. The resident follows it with the eye. No fresh cut forms. Soil remains where it was pressed. The path edge holds. This is the first direct test of the upper repair. The pond below is part of the local catchment, yet the broader water network remains present at its margins. The field channel connects to a larger route. The nearby community shrine has its own water feature. Farther away, reservoir and moat levels influence channels crossing the plain. Local autonomy, therefore, does not mean isolation, nor does connection prove that a central authority managed every pond. The archaeological model is layered. Large state works, temple communities, neighborhood features, and household choices can operate together. Their relationships likely changed through Angkor's long history. The resident lifts the basket of leaves and carries it along the firmer path. At the field corner, the adult pauses to make sure no water is backing from the larger channel. Its surface remains lower than the local mouth. The basket is set on dry ground. The leaves will not wash back during the next small shower. The adult returns empty-handed, making the circuit easier to read. Upper runoff spread, path supported, pond approach cleared, field connection open. Each action has a consequence within a few dozen steps. The pond surface holds reflections of the mound posts and the first lamplight beneath the roof. As the water lowers in coming days, the reflection will shorten and the exposed bank will widen. The resident's repair anticipates that change without claiming to control it. At the eastern side, the sediment fan beside the neighbouring path remains untouched. At the western approach, loose leaves are gone and a stable step is visible. On the field side, the drained puddle has left a damp patch that no longer hides deep mud. The adult walks the full perimeter. One section is too steep for easy access and is left rooted. Another is shallow but far from the path. The chosen approach is the place where household movement already concentrates. This ordinary selection helps interpret the archaeological pond without overfilling it with imagined practice. A depression near a mound establishes proximity and opportunity. Where sediment and access would still be uneven, people would choose workable edges. The resident presses the basket rim against the repaired step and lifts it again. The soil does not shear away. A small amount of water enters the footprint, then settles. The step will need checking after another rain and again as it dries. No schedule is invented. Repetition follows condition. When the surface changes, the adult returns. The light at the roof grows steadier. The field beyond becomes less distinct. The resident is not finished with the day, but the water task is nearing a domestic payoff. A safe approach, a usable path, and runoff that no longer cuts directly through them. One loose ridge of silt still lies where the pond approach meets the water. It is low enough to step over, but as the surface falls it could become a slippery lip. The resident kneels and moves only its upper layer into the basket. Beneath the loose deposit is firmer ground. The adult stops there. Deepening the approach would disturb the bank and create a new channel for runoff. The useful action is to expose the stable surface, not to pursue an imagined ideal depth. The basket fills halfway. Fine water drains from it and returns to the pond without carrying the larger clumps. The resident lifts the load to the dry side and spreads it thinly on a patch that does not slope toward the path. The physical demands are clear enough to support the composite. Wet silt is heavy, footing matters, and material placed carelessly can return with rain. The evidence does not tell us the resident's name, exact tool, or household rule. The narration stays with weight, slope, and consequence. Back at the edge, the stable shelf now joins the repaired step. A person can descend, set 1 foot, reach water, and climb again without crossing the deepest mud. The resident performs the movement once with the empty basket. Down, pause, fill, lift, and return. The task is ordinary by design. Greater Angkor's water landscape included countless moments when success meant a household action becoming ordinary again. The story offers no tax collector, labour roster, or order from a reservoir office. Evidence for those exact arrangements at this pond is absent. It would be easy to make the city feel organised by inventing a command. It is more accurate to let local necessity organise the scene. The resident knows the footpath because it is walked. The pond edge is checked because water is needed. The field mouth is cleared because standing water changes the ground. A community shrine and a larger channel place the household within broader networks, but neither supplies a surviving instruction for this afternoon. This restraint does not make the landscape socially empty. People built the mound, dug or maintained the pond, used the path, processed rice, tended plants, and lived near one another. Their choices accumulated in earthworks that LiDAR and excavation can now identify. What remains uncertain is how each choice was authorized or shared. The adult carries a filled basket up the repaired approach. Water shifts inside it, testing balance. The step holds. On the mound, the basket is set near the shaded working area, rather than beside the runoff groove. The route is now repeated without hesitation. Pond to path, path to mound to field, and back. The household scale circuit fits within the monumental network, but cannot be reduced to it. As the season dries, the resident may have to return to the lower shelf. After rain, the upper groove may need attention again. The present task ends when the domestic movement works, not when every future need has been solved. The consequence appears in the next ordinary journey. The resident descends with an empty basket, places a foot on the firm step, reaches the stable shelf, and lifts water without the bank sliding. On the return, the basket passes the narrowed path, while the field-side puddle remains drained. Nothing imperial has happened. A household has saved time, avoided a fall, and kept loose soil out of the pond. The field channel still empties. The planted patch remains damp without drawing down the pond. The larger route beyond the shrine stays lower than the local mouth. These are modest payoffs, but they make the neighborhood legible as part of a city. Urban life does not require every consequence to arrive at a palace. It includes repeated movement among home, water, work, field, and sacred place. The resident sets the basket beneath the roof. A lamp illuminates the damp weave and the line of mud along its lower edge. The path outside holds the last pale light. Across the pond, another mound darkens into outline. Direct address has nearly fallen away because the adult's goal is complete. The composite person remains visible, not as a symbol of an empire, but as someone whose evening is easier because a basket can move from pond to house without negotiating a collapsing step. Archaeology cannot tell us exactly who occupies this mound. Excavated residential areas within Angkor Wat's enclosure have produced evidence for domestic activity, but the social identity of all residents remains uncertain. Some may have served temples in varied roles. The material record does not support assigning one status to every household. Occupation also changed through time. On some excavated mounds, occupation spans parts of the 11th to 13th centuries, followed by a chronological gap, and later reuse beginning near the turn of the 15th century. That sequence belongs to sampled places, not a universal timetable for Greater Angkor. The adult makes one final check at the upper runoff line. The soil remains spread beneath the grass. No narrow groove has reformed. At the pond, the repaired step is dark with moisture but retains its edge. The field channel makes almost no sound. The community shrine is a fixed shadow beside the path. The great reservoir bank is hidden beyond it. This scene ends with limits attached to the evidence rather than to the person's humanity. We may not know the resident's name or exact household. We can know that Angkor's inhabited landscape required adults to manage water close to home, and that their small works sat beside the grand ones without disappearing inside them. The household story closes as the basket is placed beside the footpath for morning. The pond edge is clear enough to approach. The drained patch no longer hides soft ground. The field mouth remains open, and the mound receives runoff as a thin sheet rather than a cutting thread. The answer is layered. Greater Angkor's water landscape was not only a royal system of barrays, moats, and long channels, it was also a dispersed city of ponds, raised habitation, fields, paths, community temples, and domestic choices. Monumental works shaped conditions. Local adults responded within them, sometimes using larger routes and sometimes protecting a few steps of ground from those routes. The resident lowers the lamp beneath the roof. Its light reaches the basket rim, the first part of the footpath, and a narrow band of pond water. Beyond that band, the bank and field merge into evening. A later generation will find some familiar features changed. A channel may carry less water after drought, then far more during an intense monsoon. Sediment may close one route while erosion cuts another. Occupation may thin in one central place and continue elsewhere. No new problem enters the household task. It is complete. The transition begins only with the same footpath extending beyond the lamplight toward a later bank, where an adult will meet a network altered by centuries of additions and stress. The footpath continues beyond the lamp into a later century. At dawn, another adult stands beside a familiar south-running channel. This person is a careful composite. No record preserves the name or duty. The bank, channel, sediment, and changing occupation provide the limits of the scene. The route once carried a moderate current past the neighborhood. Now its center is cut deeper, while one bank bears a fan of fresh sand. Water from a recent hard rain has moved south with more force than the older bed comfortably held. Reeds lie flattened in the direction of flow. The adult's goal is not to restore an earlier century. It is to keep the path crossing and a nearby pond connection usable under present conditions. The first action is to walk downstream, tracing where the deeper cut begins and where the deposited fan narrows the route. This later landscape has been remodeled repeatedly. Some channels increasingly served drainage and disposal, carrying excess water away from the central area. Other features lost connections, silted, or were reused. The person sees no complete network, only a channel whose recent behavior differs from memory. At the crossing, the path has slumped into the cut. One edge remains firm enough for a basket. The adult places a hand against the damp bank, feels the soil hold, and follows the water stain toward a bend where the current escaped its former line. The bend reveals two histories at once. A pale dry shelf marks years when water seldom reached the outer bank. Beneath it, a darker fresh scar shows where the recent current struck and removed soil. Scarcity and excess have occupied the same channel, though not at the same time. Regional tree rings from mainland Southeast Asia indicate prolonged weak monsoon droughts during the 14th and early 15th centuries. They also record unusually wet intervals between those droughts. The evidence comes from trees beyond Angkor, so it reconstructs regional hydroclimate rather than daily rainfall at this bend. The adult returns to the scar. A root has been exposed, but still anchors the upper bank. Loose soil below it is already moving downstream. Pulling the root would weaken the edge. The person removes only the detached clods and places them above the active water line. During dry years, this channel may have carried little. Sediment and plants could accumulate in the bed. When stronger monsoon water returned, reduced capacity and hardened banks could concentrate the current. The chain is physically plausible, but the narration does not claim this exact scar appears in a dated excavation. The adult tests the crossing from the firm side. The path remains passable. The more urgent problem lies 10 steps lower, where deposited sand has pushed the current toward the bank. The person walks there with the basket, keeping the root behind as the marker for the return. At the sand fan, water divides around a low ridge. One thread follows the old center, the other presses against the outer bank and feeds a shallow side cut toward the pond. The side cut is new enough that grass still hangs over its edges. The adult blocks nothing immediately. The pond may need water after dry seasons, but an uncontrolled cut can enlarge during the next storm and take more than the pond edge can receive. The person walks to the pond first. Its surface stands below the side cut. A dark band shows a recent rise, yet the path beside the pond remains intact. The new thread has delivered water without overtopping the bank. The problem is the unstable entrance upstream. The tree ring record makes alternating pressure audible. Long drought, then intense rain. It does not tell the adult what to do. The local levels do. The pond can accept a small connection. The main channel must retain most of the flow. Back at the fan, the person shifts loose sand from the outer thread into the shallow center ridge, narrowing the side cut without sealing it. The action uses deposited material already in the bed and leaves the older central root lower. Water responds slowly. More enters the center. A thin branch continues toward the pond. The adult waits until both roots settle, then carries remaining loose sand above the bank. The adjustment is temporary and deliberately limited. It keeps a domestic supply possible while reducing the chance that the next strong current will abandon the main channel. The recent storm has left other signs. Bark fragments are caught high in reeds. Fine silt coats the path beyond the crossing. A small scour has formed where a field drain enters the main route. Each marks water moving with greater energy than the present trickle suggests. Paleoclimate research proposes that unusually intense wet episodes punctuated the long droughts. Such reversals could challenge a network already altered by sedimentation, erosion, and changing maintenance. Climate is one contributing pressure, not a complete explanation for political or demographic change. The adult lifts the bark fragments from the reeds. They would catch leaves in the next rise. At the field drain, the person places no barrier across the scour. Instead, loose stems are removed from the existing mouth, so incoming water can spread into the main bed rather than strike one bank. The path crossing receives attention last. A firm block of earth from the upper edge is pressed into the slumped step, restoring a narrow walking line. The person tests it with weight and withdraws when the surface holds. These actions do not secure the whole network. They keep one reach usable. Elsewhere, a major channel may be incising, an embankment may be breached, or a reservoir may be receiving less water. The adult knows only the route within walking distance. The current continues through the deeper center. The pond branch remains thin. The exposed root at the bend does not move. The immediate circuit holds under the quiet water left after the storm. Sediment preserves a second line of evidence. Cores from the West Baray show changing depositional conditions, including a sharp reduction in sedimentation rate at one sampled location during the 14th century. Researchers have related that change to altered hydrology, use, and regional climate. A core is narrow and local. It cannot tell whether this adult cleared the sand fan, whether a particular outlet was watched, or why water levels changed across the entire reservoir. The person bends over the channel and lifts a compacted layer with the edge of a wooden implement, returning attention to what is visible. The layer lies at the mouth of the pond branch. It is older and firmer than the fresh sand. Water has begun to cut beneath it, leaving a small overhang. If the overhang collapses during a rise, the branch may widen suddenly. The adult breaks only the unsupported edge and removes the pieces. The remaining bed slopes gradually into the pond root. Water crosses without undercutting. The action resembles earlier maintenance, but the context has changed. Flow is less predictable after alternating dry and wet intervals. Some central features may receive less attention as occupation patterns shift. Channels carry the accumulated effects of earlier remodeling. The person rinses the implement downstream and checks the pond. Its level is unchanged within sight. The path remains dry. A measured connection is preferable to a hidden cavity. Sediment has offered no single story of decline. It has offered a material problem, a limit on inference, and one edge that no longer waits to collapse. Farther south, the channel meets a larger cut, whose banks stand noticeably higher. The current enters at an angle. On the opposite side, a patch of coarse material records stronger flow than the fine silt upstream. Archaeological surveys have documented alterations, breaches, erosion, and sedimentation within Angkor's network. Some large channels appear to have been deeply incised, carrying water away from central areas. Such damage and remodeling show stress and change, though their precise sequence is not always secure. The adult approaches the angled junction along the upper bank. A direct crossing is no longer safe. The old footpath ends at the cut and resumes lower on the other side, suggesting people have already chosen a new route. The person does not attempt to rebuild the crossing alone. A basket is carried along the detour, and the firm edge is marked with a branch laid parallel to the path. The practical adaptation is movement around the cut, rather than repair beyond one adult's reach. At the junction, loose vegetation has gathered where the smaller channel enters. Removing it would send a sudden pulse into the deeper route. The adult clears the material in two small portions, waiting between them. Water joins without rising against the bank. The changed path matters as much as the channel. Infrastructure can continue to function differently, while everyday movement adjusts around it. The adult reaches the opposite side, looks back at the abandoned crossing, and continues toward the pond by the longer route. Modern network modeling provides a third line of evidence. Researchers have represented Angkor's connected channels as a system vulnerable to cascading effects. Under extreme variation, erosion in one reach and sedimentation in another could redirect water, concentrating damage elsewhere. The model demonstrates a plausible mechanism. It does not reproduce a witnessed medieval storm or identify the decision that created this angled junction. Its parameters are difficult to validate for an ancient landscape. The adult sees the local problem without a model. Opening the smaller channel too widely would deliver more water into the deep cut. Closing it would back water toward the pond and field. The chosen clearing keeps both routes active at reduced pressure. A branch caught downstream begins to turn in the stronger current. The person reaches it from the firm bank, lifts one end, and lets water rotate it parallel to the flow before pulling it clear. No one steps into the deep center. The action prevents one obstruction from becoming the beginning of another diversion. It cannot guarantee what happens beyond sight. That limit is shared by the modern model, though for different reasons. The adult sets the branch above the bank and watches the junction. The smaller current enters smoothly. The deep channel carries it south. No fresh scour appears during the wait. A connected network gives local actions reach. It also withholds certainty about their final consequence. The person accepts that condition and returns by the detour, carrying an empty basket past the end of the old crossing. The route home passes a channel that no longer holds water. Its bed is filled with grass and leaf litter. A low bank once directed flow toward a pond, but a later cut intercepts the path before it arrives. Along the Fausturth, this dry feature may belong to an earlier phase, a seasonal route, or a connection reduced by changing water levels. The adult does not clear it simply because it is visible. Reopening an obsolete line could drain the wrong place or carry water toward a pond no longer used in the same way. The network developed over centuries through additions and redirections. Later south-running channels sometimes cut across earlier arrangements. As political centers and settlement patterns changed, the labor available for certain features may also have changed. Evidence supports uneven transformation, not a simultaneous switch from maintenance to abandonment. The person steps over the dry bed and follows the active footpath. Its surface is worn by repeated passage, showing continued movement despite the altered channel. At the household pond, the thin branch from the main route still enters. The water is clear enough that no fresh sediment fan appears. The adult presses the inlet edge and finds it firm. The dry channel remains behind, uncorrected and unclaimed. Maintenance is selective because human attention is finite. A living landscape contains active routes, disused routes, and features whose status cannot be known from form alone. The person sets the basket by the pond and looks toward the deeper south cut. Water can still be heard there, carrying the recent storm away from the central plain. Geoarchaeological evidence from Angkor Thom's moat records a gradual reduction in land use intensity in the civic ceremonial core, beginning during the 14th century. Indicators of burning, soil disturbance, and erosion declined. The pattern begins before the famous 15th century military events, often used as a single ending. The evidence concerns sampled parts of the core. It does not mean every neighborhood emptied at once. The adult in this scene lives beside an active pond and a worn path, while a distant central zone changes. The person lifts the basket and walks toward a community shrine. Fewer fresh footprints mark one side path, but the main route remains used. This staging carries no population count. It serves only to show how uneven change might be experienced as altered movement rather than a declared collapse. At the shrine's pond, the overflow channel is dry. The bank is intact. The adult removes no vegetation because no current requires passage. Farther on, the active drainage route carries water south. Its sound is lower than at the storm's end. The person checks the branch marker beside the detour and finds the bank unchanged. The central landscape may be receiving less repeated disturbance, while households continue elsewhere. Political authority, labor organization, and residents can shift at different tempos. The adult returns toward home with the empty basket. No date announces itself. Change is present in which path is worn, which channel is active, and which water feature no longer asks for attention. Sediments from Angkor Thom's southern moat suggest that active management there had ceased by the end of the 14th century. The conclusion comes from changes in the moat record, not from a written order closing the waterworks. The adult approaches a smaller neighborhood moat or pond edge, not the royal city's sampled section. Water stands among plants. A narrow outlet has silted until only a damp line remains. The person must decide whether this local feature still needs connection. A path skirts the bank without crossing the outlet. The water level is below the inhabited mound. No recent stain reaches the path. Reopening the outlet would serve no immediate goal and might drain the remaining store after drought. The adult leaves it closed. This is not evidence of neglect. It is a local decision under different conditions. The same physical appearance, a silted opening, can mean failure in one place and useful retention in another. The contrast prevents the moat evidence from becoming a citywide story. Management ceased in a sampled central feature. Elsewhere, people continued to maintain, reuse, or ignore waterworks according to changing needs. The person removes one loose branch from the walking edge and carries it to dry ground. The pond remains still. The main path stays open. As afternoon lowers, water in the south-running channel becomes the only moving surface nearby. The adult follows its sound back toward the repaired crossing, where recent intervention can still be evaluated directly. Climate alone cannot explain Angkor's transformation. Political conflict affected the region. Trade increasingly linked centers nearer the Mekong and coast. Religious practice changed. Elites and other residents shifted their locations. Labor available for some state works may have altered. These factors overlap, and scholarship continues to debate their relative weight. The adult does not experience them as a list. The practical sign is that a route once serving one destination now carries water past it, while a market path or household connection points elsewhere. A familiar feature remains in the ground after its social setting changes. At the repaired crossing, the firm block placed earlier has settled but not slipped. The deeper channel still prevents the old direct path from continuing. People use the detour. The person smooths one sharp edge where repeated feet have cut the bank. No attempt is made to return the crossing to an earlier alignment. The new route is longer and stable. Adaptation can preserve movement without restoring former form. The water in the channel has fallen enough to expose coarse sediment at the junction. The person lifts a single lodged branch and leaves the gravel. Removing the coarse bed could deepen the cut further. Political, economic, demographic, and religious changes remain beyond the adult's control. Their local consequence is a different pattern of maintenance. Some paths wear, some openings close, some drains carry more, and some monumental reaches receive less attention. The year 1431 is often treated as a dramatic full stop because chronicles record conflict involving Angkor and Ayutthaya. Archaeology does not support saying the entire city vanished in that year. Change had begun earlier in parts of the core and continued unevenly afterward. The adult reaches the mound as evening approaches. Smoke rises from a cooking area in restrained outline. A basket is rinsed at the pond. The path remains active. These details are plausible domestic staging, not proof for one dated household. At Angkor Wat, excavated occupation mounds show a more complicated sequence. use in the 11th through 13th centuries, a gap in the sampled chronology, and renewed activity from around the late 14th or early 15th century into later centuries. The temple retained residential and ideological importance. The person places the basket beneath the roof. Water from the recent storm has receded below the repaired pond inlet. The narrowed side branch remains open enough to keep the edge damp. There is no need to deny major political and demographic change. The centre's importance shifted. Some areas lost population or activity. Infrastructure deteriorated or changed. The correction is to replace a single disappearance with multiple tempos. The adult makes one last walk to the channel. The exposed route at the bend holds. The sand fan directs most water through the center. The longer footpath around the deep cut remains passable. Life continues not as an unchanged empire, but as people adjusting within a landscape whose earlier works still shape their options. The pond beside the mound carries both continuity and alteration. Its bank is familiar. Its inlet now receives a reduced thread from a channel reshaped by stronger drainage. The old dry route through the grass remains unused. Occupation evidence cannot make every later resident visible, but it shows that Angkorian places were reused. Mounds could be occupied again after gaps. Temples remained active. Communities lived within and around the monumental landscape long after royal focus shifted. The adult clears a few loose leaves from the pond approach. The task resembles the earlier household story because ordinary needs recur. Its context is different. The main channel no longer behaves as it once did, and the neighborhood's connections have changed. A worn step at the waterline is reinforced with firm soil from the mound side. The person presses it, waits, and tests it with a foot. The basket can descend without tilting. This action is small enough to survive the uncertainty of the period. It does not require a restored palace administration or a vanished population. It requires one adult, one used pond, and one bank that benefits from attention. The lamp is lit beneath the roof. Its reflection reaches the repaired step. Beyond the pond, the active south channel makes a low sound while the dry channel makes none. The person leaves both as they are. Continued life does not mean every former feature remains useful. It means people keep choosing among inherited works, maintaining some, adapting others, and allowing still others to settle into the ground. Over the following generations, political and commercial centers shifted, but the Angkor region remained inhabited, visited, farmed, and sacred. The stone temples did not become the possessions of an absent people. Khmer communities continued to know and use the landscape. The composite adult walks the causeway near a moat whose water reflects a tower. The familiar image remains, but surrounding routes differ. A later channel cuts across an earlier grid. A pond beside habitation remains useful. A former outlet stands above the present level. Surface rain accounts for it. No focused seep appears. The person continues without repair. This negative finding becomes part of the closing payoff. Networks are not only stories of breakdown. They include reaches that hold, features that are repurposed, and places that need no action today. Stress is real without making every bank fail at once. The adult reaches the lower footpath and follows it past the pond. The lamp at the mound is visible through the posts. Water in the south channel continues toward the lower plain. Political form has changed. Human action has not stopped. The region's residents keep reading damp soil, water level, path, and bank, even when the great system no longer operates in the same configuration. In the present, Cambodian institutions and communities continue to conserve and live with Angkor's water landscape. Apasara National Authority has restored channels, dikes, reservoirs, and circulation in parts of the site with Cambodian and international partners. Angkor is managed as a living heritage landscape, not as an abandoned hydraulic puzzle. Modern repairs show that ancient alignments can still conduct water when cleared and reconnected. They also protect monuments and inhabited areas under present conditions. The work cannot be projected backward as proof of medieval procedures or authority. The narration returns at once to the later adult's hand on the bank. Damp soil presses cool against the palm. The route is usable for the evening. The pond inlet is narrow but open. The detour around the deep cut is firm. This is the final evidence distinction. Archaeology maps surviving form. Sediment and pollen record local environmental change. Tree rings reconstruct regional hydroclimate. Excavation dates sampled occupation. Modeling tests plausible network behavior. Restoration demonstrates modern physical possibility. None alone supplies the whole history. The adult needs no whole history to complete the circuit. The exposed root holds. The bark and branches are gone from the current. The path reaches home. Continued conservation in the modern landscape belongs to Khmer people and institutions. The medieval composite remains unnamed. Both moments are joined by the recurring need to look closely at water moving through inherited earth. The later story ends without a single cause or a vanished city. Droughts and unusually intense monsoons placed serious pressure on a large connected network. Sedimentation, erosion, damage, remodeling, and changing maintenance mattered. Political conflict, trade shifts, religious change, and movements of elites and population also belonged to the transformation. Different evidence traces different parts of that process. Together it supports a long, uneven change rather than one hydraulic collapse in 1431. Some central activity declined before that date. Some mounds were used again afterward. Temples and communities continued. Waterworks remained active, altered, or selectively maintained. The adult places the basket beside the footpath. The pond approach is firm. The thin inlet continues. The deeper south channel carries the last stormwater away. A dry older route lies quiet under grass. The ordinary goal has been met. One familiar reach remains usable in a changed arrangement. Nothing has returned to an earlier ideal, and nothing needs to. The story now releases names, dates, causes, and questions. Only images already handled will remain. Rain on a bank, a quiet pond, a causeway and gate, a basket by the path, lamplight beneath a roof, and a hand checking damp soil. The adult lowers the hand from the bank and walks toward the lamp. The moving water softens behind the footpath. Rain rests on the bank in separate drops. The channel below keeps its low, familiar sound. A hand touches the damp soil where the surface is firm, then lifts away. Water follows the intended bed past the roots and leaves. Nothing is widened, nothing is pressed. The bank, the hand, and the quiet current remain together for a little while, with the rain moving lightly across them. The basket is quiet on the path above. The pond holds a small field of lamplight. Beside it, the basket waits on the higher edge, its weave dark where water has passed through. The cleared step reaches the surface. The footpath curves around the bank and returns toward the roof. The pond does not change while it is watched. The basket stays where it was placed, and the reflected light settles between its narrow lines. Rain touches the pond beyond the light. Along the causeway, the gate stands beyond still water. The path is empty now. Rain lies in shallow marks on the stone and earth, and the moat carries the softened reflection beneath the opening. Nothing crosses. The familiar bank continues on either side, holding its dark line. The gate, the causeway, and the water remain in the same quiet arrangement as the light lowers. The basket rests farther along the same footpath. The footpath passes the pond and reaches the basket again. Lamplight touches the first firm step, the damp rim, and a short line of grass. Beyond it, the path fades without leaving the landscape. The channel can still be heard behind the bank. Rain moves from leaf to leaf. The basket remains beside the path, ready but unused, while the light rests on the pond edge. A hand rests briefly on the damp soil. A hand returns once more to the damp soil. The bank holds beneath the palm. Nearby, water passes the gate. The pond keeps its lamplight, and the basket waits beside the footpath. Rain has become a faint pattern on the leaves in the causeway. The hand lifts, the soil keeps the shape of the touch for a moment, then only the bank, the water, and the low light remain. The channel moves softly,